Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, Tristan and I dive deep into the Data Vault architecture. And we're joined by Brandon Taylor, who's a senior data architect at Guild Education, and Michael Olschimke, who's the CEO of Scalefree, a consulting firm who are experts in the space. The two of them speak about what is a data vault, who should consider setting one up, and how to get started on implementing one. Data vault was a new concept for me, but a number of our sellers, especially in EMEA, have been hearing about lots of companies who swear by it. So we wanted to learn more.
This was a fun episode for me too, but maybe from a little bit of a different perspective. I hope that my personal biases didn't show in this episode too much because, data modeling methodologies end up becoming like very strongly held beliefs because they really kind of reflect your own personal style as much as anything. And I am really a Kimball person. That's not to say that there's a right or wrong, but I think that aligns with the way that my brain works. But anyway, I've gone through the process of learning Data Vault. I get it, but I never really understood before this episode, why anyone would want to do that, because it's such a different process from the modeling that I have done in my lifetime. Anyway, I thought that the answers on why Data Vault were very compelling, and ultimately it's about having a really structured approach that scales well to a large team so that everybody's doing it the same way. I totally buy that why that's a valid approach in the right context.
Yeah, I think what we got into in this episode is any approach you take, there are trade-offs.
Yep.
And what stood out to me too is just how enduring some of these modeling architectures have lasted, even before we had cloud data warehouses.
You and I are both going to be retired off to some retirement community somewhere, and people will still be doing Kimball and people will still be doing Data Vault.
Yeah. And so it was fun to see how much fervor there was around this approach and what are the benefits if you want to take the time to set it up, because it's not a small lift, it's a big lift, and it's a fun episode to just hear more and learn. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the show. So today we're going to be talking about a concept that was new to me called the Data Vault. And if it's new for you as well, it's a term we're going to go into in depth throughout the episode, but it's a data modeling design pattern. And we invited two guests to join us to talk about it more. Brandon Taylor, who's a senior data architect at Guild, and Mike Olschimke, who's the CEO of Scalefree, which is a consulting firm who's credited with actually being the designer of the original Data Vault architecture. So I want to give you both a chance to introduce yourself and tell a little bit more about your background. Brandon, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. So my name is Brandon Taylor. I've been in the data industry for a little over 10 years now, and I've built data warehouses and specifically for this episode, Data Vault implementations for industries ranging from healthcare, higher education, manufacturing, and big tech. But my passion has always been mentorship and education, which brought me to Guild. And here we leverage our platform to enable our members to achieve their career mobility wants and needs, higher education needs, and very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We didn't invent Data Vault, but one of our co-founders, Dan Lindstedt, he invented it back in the 90s as a concept for building large-scale enterprise data systems with high requirements, let's say. And I'm the co-founder of Scalefree. Together with Dan, we founded a company here in Europe in order to essentially do, for one thing, train the audience, the industry about the concept. So we operate training essentially and do consulting essentially in this regard, helping clients to take advantage of data vaults, to build data-driven platforms, to essentially in a data-driven organization essentially. And we serve customers typically from the higher mid-size size to larger enterprise customers building data vaults essentially.
You said it, you first designed it, or it was first designed in the 90s. And Kimball, which is one of the other really popular modeling designs, was also introduced in 1996. And so when I was prepping for this episode, it kind of blew my mind that the best design patterns were built pre-cloud. And they have a lot of staying power. Can maybe we do an overview of if I'm starting from fresh and I need to pick a good modeling design pattern for my data warehouse, what are my options? And are these the most modern, best choices we have today? Like, what can I pick from? Mike, you want to go first?
The thing is, so data was invented in the 90s, but it was developed initially in a classified context in government, in US government. And so the development started around the early 90s, 92, I believe. And finally in 2001, Dan published the first articles on the concept. Problem was, it was a bit different to what people did. And, but it was very successful in the classified space, essentially analyzing data. So that's one thing. Back in the 90s, he developed it, essentially the competition to Data Vault back then was really Inman, Kimball, and Data Vault essentially. Nowadays, I would say that most clients, at least the ones that we deal with, they typically decide or have to choose between either using a Data Vault on a greenfield project or using a, let's say, data science approach, data lake approach, essentially, schema read approach. That's what I would say is the real competition between Data Vault and data lakes, essentially. That's what we see at least.
And maybe good to just give, what is the high level architecture of a data vault? Like, what are the kind of fundamental building blocks that fit that pattern? Okay,
cool. Building blocks is the right word. Think about this. Let's say, so first of all, data vault is really a modeling technique, but it's also a concept for building in the end enterprise database systems. So I don't call myself a data vault modeler. My goal here is to build enterprise database systems that have specific requirements. And a lot of our customers, they have, let's say, requirements regarding they need to ingest all kinds of data from all kinds of source systems. So it's the typical structured data that comes in batches overnight, but also real-time data, CDC data, unstructured data, semi-structured data, JSON data, XML data, and so on. All kinds of data should be absorbed by this enterprise data warehouse. And the system should essentially deliver the information that we extract from the data, the enterprise data, deliver this information to any user, regardless of their needs. So some users might have specific business rules they want to apply because they're sitting in headquarters. They want to apply, let's say, a CM system to be the leading system. But in a subsidiary, they want to use a different system, a different CM system as the leading system. So the leading system versus secondary system is one thing. You might sit in a different tax region. That's why you have to apply different tax rules, essentially, and so on. So different business rules depending on the context you're in. Back in the 90s, the assumption was there's a single version of truth. But that's not true for enterprise organizations, not even for smaller companies. There's different versions of truth depending on which context you're in, what your requirements are, and so on. And then the other thing is the enterprise data warehouse system. In the early days, you had one server in the basement where everything was located. Nowadays, these are highly distributed, where some parts of your solution are in the basement. Let's say your customer data is super confidential, can't be loaded into the cloud. But then you have, let's say, IoT streams in the cloud. You follow a multi-cloud strategy where you don't want to have dependencies on one of the cloud providers. So some part is in Azure Cloud, some is in the Google Cloud, some is in Amazon. And so you want to distribute the enterprise data essentially. And those requirements, those we can meet with Data Vault. The other thing is conceptually, building blocks, a keyword here. Think about this. I have a door here. And let's say my kid comes in and says, here, daddy, see what I've built? A blue Lego house, like these Lego bricks from Denmark, right? A blue Lego house. The problem is the kid comes in every day with a blue Lego house. Little modifications, a chimney more or less, one window more or less, that kind of stuff, right? But in general, it's a blue house. But what I would like to see is a red ship or a yellow tower, that kind of stuff, right? Not a blue house. So what I do is, and sorry for that, could be adult only here. I send out the kids, close the door, make sure the kid is out, and I take the Lego bricks house and dump it on the floor. That's why the kid have to go out. I dump it on the floor, and what you have on the ground are now all these blue bricks, the individual components of the incoming model. Now, I want to have a red ship. So I'm picking up the bricks I need. I'm recoloring them into red and assembling my red ship. And that's Data Vault in a nutshell. We have an incoming data model. It's more or less the same. That's a source model. The structure changes a bit. There's a window more or color more in our case, more or less, right? There's some changes, but more or less you get the blue house every day. What we do is we break the data set into fundamental components of the data. All your data, your enterprise data, but also your personal data on your favorite social network has three fundamental components: business keys, relationships between business keys, and descriptive data. Those are the building blocks of your data, essentially. And we capture those building blocks in three base entities: hubs for business keys, links for relationships, and satellites for descriptive data. The idea of Data Vault is really to get the data as quick as possible into the database page. And it's a very, very physical model then. Dump the data into the database page, but organize it on the database level so you can quickly derive any target model you want, like the Redshift and so on, right? The problem is you have blue bricks, raw data, as we call it. And we use transformation rules in the business world to turn the blue bricks into red bricks, apply business rules, for example, for cleansing data, for turning, let's say, foreign currencies into a leading currency, and so on. And then in the information mart, we just virtualize I said red chip. It's just an assembly. We just assemble or stick now bricks together. So it looks like a red chip essentially. But if the next user comes in from, let's say, a subsidiary, we can also produce a yellow tower or a green car and so on. So that's the flexibility. We can use data and turn it to anything we want, or the user wants essentially. That's the idea.
I love the conceptual approach that you're describing. It's very appealing to say like, okay, let's go through this structured process where we kind of break the data down to its component parts and then we can reassemble whatever we want. And, I could ask a bunch of questions about performance implications and all these kind of detailed, more tactical things. But as we're talking about this, I have a bunch of stuff going through my head. Maybe one of the biggest things is, why do we need a kind of like overarching strategy for how we design our data models, our data warehouse in the first place? Maybe it seems obvious that we would need some like big overarching strategy, but that is generally not how software engineers go about architecting large scale systems. Software engineers break the large problem down into smaller problems, and then they assign those smaller problems out into teams, and then those teams get to choose their own frameworks, their own architectures, and they expose interfaces to other teams. And as long as those interfaces perform as required, then it's kind of an implementation decision that team gets to make. So like, why are we as data warehouse practitioners in the business of trying to specify this stuff at such a like high level in the first place?
I think the most important part of a good data warehouse is that it reflects your business. And I think with software engineering, you have domain-driven design. And so within your domain, you might have a very specific concept of what a customer is or what a prospect is. But within data warehousing, once the business wants to know how many customers do they have, what's our sales funnel, you have to be very specific in your build to know what is a customer, what are the business rules to define a customer. And so in data warehousing, we need to come to that shared understanding for the business and make sure that we're all speaking the same language. We don't want marketing to see that we have 10,000 customers, but sales sees we have 9,000. Suddenly there's miscommunication and we don't all understand, our numbers. Your leadership starts to see different metrics and things go off the rails really quickly. So I think first and foremost, all of your data warehouse implementations have to match the business, and you have to have that shared understanding of your business rules and what your metrics really should look like across the business. But then secondly, I think there's this concept of like data literacy at scale. So if you want your business users to get into your BI dashboards and start playing around and self-serving with your data, you don't want them to have to cobble together a view of customers across 10 different systems. They might join data incorrectly. There might be different ways of viewing that data. But if we come to a shared understanding, like in a Kimball model, a DIM customer, and we have this one source of truth for customer across the business, then any analyst, you can onboard a new analyst and say, start with DIM customer. That's where we get our data for this particular business object, or start with a specific fact table to get data about this specific process. And that ensures that we're getting same metrics across the organization, and we don't have this spiraling out of control where everyone's doing significant UAT over all of their reports to figure out why are these data points mismatched. We can instead say we're all looking at the same view of the data, regardless of, and Michael, I love the Lego blocks example because I use the same thing. As long as we're all assembling the same view of a yellow tower or a green car, we're all looking at the same thing. But if you ask everyone, here's your green Legos, go build a car, you're going to get different cars.
I want to put a pin in this because I want to ask later in the conversation about data mesh. It's possible that the data mesh way of looking at things may change, our approaches as an industry to some of this stuff. But let's hold off on that for later. We've been talking about Data Vault. You mentioned Kimball. Mike, you mentioned Inman. Let's say that somebody was listening to this podcast who was not a data practitioner. This conversation is going to sound super dry. They're going to move right along to the next health and fitness podcast and just like push a hard pause on this episode, which is fine. We're a podcast for data practitioners. But I think it's almost like surprising how almost religious people's feelings are on some of these topics. And we're kind of like glossing over that a little bit. In Coalesce 2021, we had a presentation from the CEO of Chartio, and he made the contention that Kimball was dead because the cloud changes everything. And this was the most contentious Coalesce presentation that we had ever had. People had very, very strong feelings about this. Why is this overall topic, like data modeling methodology, why does it spur such strong feelings?
I believe because a lot of people have invested a lot of time in learning a lot of concepts and applying them, invested a lot of money and budgets into solutions. I think that's one part of the problem. So you're really, it's like a favorite car brand, right? So we don't need to argue about the brand I'm driving. That's the best car, essentially. Sure. Because I spent the money for it. I'm used to it and so on. So that's maybe one piece. What happens is that requirements, not the cloud is changing the issue here. It's really the requirements, the enterprise requirements. So back then, when I first initially learned about Data Vault, I realized the value of Data Vault because I made an assumption. But back in 2011 or 12, it was obvious that the data volume increases exponentially, right? That was clear back then already. But what also was clear to me was, but not to everybody in the industry, that the requirements and how we process data, like regarding auditability, lineage, security, privacy, being able to delete data, those requirements how we process data will also increase. And Data Vault has a lot of solutions for those requirements, even though not all of them are required in the industry yet. Still, we have all these solutions already. I remember back in 2011 or 12, I had a training and I made the claim that you might, in a data warehouse, that you might have to delete data sometimes. I knew it because I was coming from a context where they had to delete data for a legal reason. But all the senior ETL guys in the room told me, hey, Mike, you're the youngster here. Let us explain you how the business works. We only collect data. We never delete data, period. And then came, first of all, the code of conduct in the insurance industry. Then came GDPR. And then I could explain them how to delete data in a data warehouse because I knew that said that. So the requirements, how we process data, those will increase. And that's essentially when you realize that your solution might not work out, that the solution has a limit. That's, and it's not, and that's when you might start thinking about having another solution, essentially. And that's where Data Vault comes into play, essentially.
And for myself, I think a lot of data architects and data modelers have been in the trenches enough where we've seen that you can't just throw technology at a problem and the magic wand is waved and all of your problems disappear. I believe technology is a lever, and we have the longest lever we've ever had. The technology is fantastic out there today, but all it's going to do is scale your process. So if you have a poor process and you bring all the best technology to bear on this process, you're just going to scale a bad process and it's going to break eventually. And I've seen it happen plenty of times. If you've got the right processes in place, then you can bring your technology to bear on that and it scales beautifully. And I think that's why so many of us lean on Data Vault, Kimball, less so Inman in the industry today. And the reason that we use these is because they're proven processes that we know work, and there's problems with all of them, but we found ways around those. And so all of this technology helps to improve those processes and we get better. I would imagine that CEO probably has a very highly data literate organization. And so if you have a bunch of folks that know what they're doing and you have a well understood process, you can't just dump all of your data into a S3 bucket and let everyone go wild with data science algorithms or what have you. But if you're in an organization that's, just building one-off views for every report that they need, and you end up with this house of cards of cascading views, calling views, eventually it breaks. It happens every time. So if you don't have the right processes in place, then the technology just exacerbates the problem. And I think that's why we lean on these data modeling methodologies so that we can bring good processes to bear and then let the technology do what it does best.
Brandon, I want to hear a little bit more about what it was like at Guild implementing this, because we touched on it a little bit, but there's a bunch of different parts to the Data Vault architecture. We touched on satellites. We talked about change data capture. It seems like a pretty involved beast to get up and running, and it's not for the faint of heart. Why did you arrive at this decision that you had to, like enough was enough and you had to go spend the time to like do it the way that you felt was going to scale for Gil? Did you like hit on the same problem one too many times, like the views on views on views? Like what was that? And then how did you go about taking the first step of getting towards like a best practice here?
So at Guild, we do a really interesting thing where the first 2 weeks of your onboarding, you go through a sort of tour of duty, talking to your different stakeholders that you're going to be working with regularly, just to get a sense of what their problems are. And I heard 3 things over and over from everyone that I spoke with. Number one, we had no way to reproduce any of our historical reports. It's September 7th that we're recording this. In the past, there was no way to rerun a end of month report for January. Couldn't do it. As the data came in, everything was refreshed in the data warehouse, and we couldn't recreate our reports. Number two, we're a microservice-based organization, and so we were breaking apart these different monoliths into smaller and smaller services. And at this point, we're at around 70, 80 different source systems, and the data teams just couldn't keep up with that rate of change. So suddenly our engineering squads were having to do dual writes to old systems and new systems, and that was extra effort and work on their side, extra cost incurred. And then number 3, every business user I talked to said that if you ask 2 developers for a report, you were probably going to get 3 different answers. So one of the first things I did was pulled up our DBT DAG, and it was the most beautiful mess of spaghetti you have ever seen, just lines everywhere. And I said, okay, we need to bring some process to bear on this. Originally, when I came to Guild, I honestly expected to be able to just do a dimensional model and be good, since it's a relatively light industry. And I didn't expect all of the complications that we have. But after hearing those issues, I said, Data Vault is really the right choice for this. Historical versioning just comes out of the box with part of the process. Being able to change out source systems on the fly quickly and easily comes as part of the process. And then as long as we have a common process for how we're building, I'm not as worried about developers deriving different information because we're all looking at the same data, the same models. To start the journey, it was a lot of enablement, a lot of data literacy work. I sat down with the teams for about a week and just walked through, this is what a hub is, this is what a satellite is, this is a link. And in parallel, I started working with the business to better understand, what is it exactly that we do here? There's a book by Lawrence Core called Agile Data Warehouse Design that I love to use for gathering requirements. So I leveraged his BEAM process to figure out, what do we do? What are the key business objects? What are the key processes? And then started taking that and building a very high level top-down view of what I thought the data warehouse should look like, just looking at hubs and links. What are our business objects? What are the processes where those different business objects interrelate? And showed that to the team. And then they started it started clicking for them and realizing, okay, well, we get some of our data from our members from this system. Great, let's grab it, create a satellite. We get some of our data from this process from this system. Great, grab it and create a satellite. And so they were able to take that top-down view that I built, and based on their understanding of sort of their bottom-up source to target mapping, they were able to then just go and scale with building the right satellites based to get derived attributes for each of those objects and processes. We also found that the DBT Vault implementation was incredibly useful for us, just for creating all of the metadata needed for the data vault. And from there, we started projecting that data out into facts and dimensions. And that's really where we are today, building out that single source of truth and shared understanding of our data.
Brandon, I love that you mentioned the Agile Data Warehouse book. And earlier, we were talking about Data Vault 2.0, Dan Lindstedt's book. There's only so many kind of canonical texts in our field. And I think those are 2 of the most I think they may be the 2 most important books that I've ever read about this profession. And so it's neat that they've both come up in this conversation. And like anybody reading this hour-long conversation is going to very much scratch the surface. But if you read those 2 books, you will download quite a lot of this into your brain.
Yes, completely agreed. And if I also may plug Elephant in the Fridge by John Giles. I've got that one over here too. It's a really good union of those 2 books. It gives you a really good high-level understanding of both Data Vault and the concept of business objects and processes.
How long does a redesign like that take? It sounds really good in description where you're like figuring out how all of your different data domains relate to each other. You just take a new source data, put it in a satellite. Sounds easy, but I think in practice, like getting the right mapping is hard, and usually like sitting down and papering how everything relates to each other, you're not going to get it right on the first time, and you're likely going to get it very wrong on the first time. Is that process months for you, going on that journey of like redesigning how your data comes into your warehouse, how it gets modeled? How long would an enterprise expect to have to go on that journey to come out on the other side successful?
When I was a consultant, my usual line to clients was with a team of people that know what they're doing, i.e. my consultant team with me. A data warehouse implementation is usually about a year and $1 million. And then depending on the size of the organization from there, it might go up or down. But that's my baseline for a team to come in and build this for you with them already having the tools and skills needed. At Guild, it's taken us a little longer, but that's because I spent the time up front to train the team, make sure everyone understood what we were doing, why we were doing it, how we were building it. I would say we're about a year and a half into the project at this point. It's not done because I don't think data warehousing is ever completely done. But we are at a point now where we have many of our reports that are generated based off the data from the new implementation and relatively little based off of the old.
Got it. So this is not for the faint of heart. You have to really want to go down this journey.
You have to want to go down the journey, and you have to get organizational buy-in, and you have to get leadership buy-in. This isn't something that you can just do on the side and one day magically it appears. Everyone has to be involved. You have to have buy-in from the business because you need their time to understand what are the objects, what are the processes, what are we trying to do. You have to have time from your technology teams because they're the ones that are going to help you with that source to target mapping to understand what is the source of truth for first name, what is the source of truth for any given process. You've got to have buy-in across the organization.
So the origin for this episode, or why we decided to have an episode about Data Vault, is because we were hearing about it a lot from EMEA, large enterprise in particular. And we touched on it a little bit about how EMEA has really like specific data governing policies and regulations. Is that driving at all any of the motivation to want to go on this data architecture journey, or is it just popular in EMEA because the original authors were European?
I mean, Dan developed this in the US government. So he's American, right? So he lives in the US. But I would say the reasons why so we have a gut feeling to some extent why it's popular in Europe. There's multiple explanations, to be honest. One explanation is I would say that in at least in Germany, there was a lack of data-driven solutions. So we didn't have these Kimball designs, image designs that much as in the Anglo-Saxon, like in the US or UK, for example. So the thing is, when you have a working solution, why would you replace it, right? So there must be a reason that you go to replace it by something better. So if you have something, and in the US, we believe there were more solutions, there was less demand for something new or better, whatever. And so that at least in Germany, in other European countries, that we had to catch up a bit, essentially on the US. That might drive part of it. The other part of it is essentially that we educated a lot. So we had a lot of trainings essentially in Europe. So we were very open in the training business, getting a lot of people into the training, essentially did a lot of good marketing that increased the knowledge about data vaults in European countries. And then the other thing is really the killer argument essentially were GDPR, essentially the introduction of general data protection guideline, whatever. That was a driver because now all of a sudden you had increased requirements for your data processing. You could not just dump the data on an S3 bucket and build views on it. That didn't work anymore. So you essentially had to know what kind of data you're dumping there. Is there any personal data in there? And you had to remove or better even reduce consumer records because you could keep some detail, the non-personal details. That's what you want to keep actually for historical reasons, right? You want to know how many customers we had in the past, the last 30 years, but you're not allowed to know who that is behind that customer role, essentially. And those increasing requirements, those were essentially, there was a big driver. And with smaller drivers like this before, like, as I said, in the German insurance industry, we had, for example, the code of conduct, where essentially the insurance industry in Germany tried to prevent the federal government introducing a more strict data privacy guideline. Well, you know how it ended up. That's one thing. So it was in 2012. And then we had also privacy concerns in Germany for historical reasons. There's lots of privacy concerns. That's also driving a lot of data processing.
I had mentioned before, data mesh. This is a topic that's also very relevant or like on the minds of data leaders in large enterprises in Europe and the US, I think. To what extent do you folks think that data mesh impacts the practice of data warehouse design? Here's the way that I hope this becomes true. My hope is that you can start to be a little bit more domain driven in how some of these decisions are made, so that rather than thinking about the decision to adopt a particular data warehouse design methodology is at the like enterprise level, now it's at the domain level. And the expectation is that as long as you can meet a certain set of contracts with other domains in the business, then you're okay. And maybe like all these different domains, they all choose to use Data Vault or, a common methodology, or maybe they don't. That's like the bias that I'm coming to this question with. But I'm curious if you folks see this the same way, or just generally how you see Data Vault and Data Mesh interacting with one another.
I think data mesh really comes down to whether you want a consolidated data management strategy or a federated strategy. And if federated, then I think data mesh is the right call. I love data mesh conceptually. I think it has a great set of principles for how to manage your data in a domain-driven way. I think the challenge is there's still some of the process that needs to be worked out. And that's why the few data mesh implementations that I've heard of in the industry that sounds like they went exceptionally well was more of a marriage between Data Vault and data mesh. So we're still federating out our data management strategy and letting domain teams manage their data and now the transformations of their data. So we're embedding data analysts, data engineers, analytics engineers onto those teams. But in terms of the actual process for how we store that data, hold that data, and manage it, I've seen fantastic implementations where that back end is still a, effectively satellite or series of satellites in the Data Vault methodology. And then you have some centralized, maybe a GraphQL gateway or some API management product that can manage your individual hubs and links between those, so that for someone outside of your domain, they can go in and see, okay, who owns the concept of a customer or who owns the concept of sales? And then you can dive deep into what are the different satellites that they have. But really, it comes down to very strict data governance, and you have to be willing to let the reins go as a data organization and start to embed your analysts within those squads and have a very tight coupling between them, rather than this, centralized monolith of data organizations that we typically see today, where we, let's put it all into a data warehouse and then we'll build all of the analytics out of that.
I love distributed systems by heart. Seriously, the Data Vault in that sense has many similarities actually to Data Mesh. We can use the Data Vault to implement the Data Mesh strategy, and you can use a Data Vault. And we have customers. We have any range of customers, right? So we have customers where they have this monolithic approach. They have a centralized enterprise data warehouse, everything in one space, only in one spot, and everybody's using this huge system essentially. But we have also customers where they have distributed enterprise data warehouse. Some customers, they, let's say, have individual data warehouse solutions based on Data Vault in different plans or different domains, different departments, and so on. They do synchronize data, they integrate these data sets, that works. We also have customers where they have even more distribution. We're thinking about this when you have, let's say, ships, container ships or something, when they're on the ocean, Pacific or Atlantic, they don't have an internet connection or very expensive internet connection via satellite dish, essentially. What they do is they still have sensor data on these ships. So they collect the sensor data. And when they enter the harbor, they get a Wi-Fi connection or a cheaper LTE connection and upload the data once in a while, essentially. So very highly distributed enterprise data warehouse, essentially. Even that works. And yeah, so the thing is, the challenge, I would say, for every organization, regardless if you're using Data Vault or not Data Vault to implement the data mesh strategy, in my opinion, the key for distribution to make it really work or to make it successful, let's say, is that you standardize. Because if you don't standardize how you implement these individual distributed parts, then you end up in a mess. That's why it's non-standard distribution ends up in the mess. If you standardize it, those individual components will fit together and you can use them and leverage them as combinations. Actually, that's the basic idea. So this standardization is for me is key for distribution here.
And when you recommend data vault, data mesh for organizations of any size, it sticks out to me that, Guild is a growth company. It's not a large enterprise company yet, but yet you felt like it was worth taking on a 1.5 year endeavor to get your data in a state where you could reproduce reports from a year ago. And it could be because of the industries you're serving. But is it for everyone, for some? Who would you guide towards thinking about really considering a data vault design?
I don't think there is a type of organization that just full stop, it's not acceptable for. Anyone can use it. I think it's unnecessary for some organizations, and particularly my deciding point on that is usually the number of source systems that you have. If you're a company that's primarily on Salesforce or a single CRM, and you have 1 or 2 ancillary systems to sort of help out with that, 3 to 5 systems maybe, it's probably overkill and probably an extra step that you don't need to take. A just standard star schema Kimball approach with slowly changing dimensions will probably meet all of your needs, and you don't need that extra integration layer of a data vault. You can still do it because it's effectively less work at that point because you're integrating less systems. But I don't think it's entirely necessary, and you can skip the step. And I in my consulting days, that's usually what I would suggest. If we're 5 or less source systems, let's just build this as a dimensional model, and we're probably going to be okay. Anything more than that, it starts to become so difficult to combine those multiple sources, and you're probably continuing to expand your sources. Once you get to 10 or more, you're probably going to continue to grow that. And you're probably going to reach a point where it becomes a real challenge to integrate all of those systems together. And Data Vault just handles that so wonderfully that I would suggest, in those cases, give it a chance.
It's really, I agree and disagree to a bit. So I would say it's not really the number of source systems, because if you have a very simple solution or simple requirement, the data was also simple, to be honest. The challenge is the requirement. First of all, when would I not recommend Data Vault to a client? I would ask you what to pain. If you don't have any pain in your solution, why do you think about another solution, right? So just keep what you have. So if there's no pain, just keep what you have. There's no reason to switch, essentially. But the pain typically kicks in with additional requirements that you didn't anticipate it in the initial design. And again, GDPR might be a reason. That might be the reason that you're dealing with cloud systems these days, or your volume goes up and you can't deal with your single environment in a single node environment anymore. You go to an MPP database. The reason could be that you have, let's say, you're dealing with real-time data nowadays, or unstructured data, and so on. So there's additional requirements, and that leads essentially to the need of having a new solution. And that's when Data Vault kicks in, essentially. But as I said, even if your requirements are minimal, let's say you have clean data, you have no GDPR requirements, no security, no nothing. The Data Vault is also very simple. The problem is Data Vault has a solution for everything, at least in a data-driven domain. And with that in mind, the problem is that every solution that we attach, because your data is dirty or you have GDPR requirements, you have to delete data, you have to reduce consumer data, you have to secure your data sets. Every solution that we add to the Data Vault adds complexity to some extent. So it gets more and more complicated, but that's not a problem of the Data Vault. That's essentially because of your requirements and the way you work with data, essentially. You shouldn't have dirty data, right? No duplicates and so on.
Going back to our conversation about like the near religiosity that some people hang on to their preferred data modeling methodologies, what do you think somebody would say if they were a part of this conversation who was a Kimball maximalist? They said, Brandon, they heard you say Kimball is really not a great solution if you've got more than 5 source data systems. Probably people have pushed Kimball way, way farther than that. What do you think the argument on the other side of this debate is?
Data Vault is an extra step in the process and unnecessary as long as you have the right data literacy and the right team. And I've heard that one before. I've pitched Data Vault to companies that have a embedded data architect already that live and die by the data warehouse toolkit by Kimball. And to be fair, it is true. You do not have to have Data Vault. You can solve your problems with a dimensional model. I find that Data Vault makes some problems much easier to solve than trying to go full Kimball.
I love that you said that because that mirrors my own experiences. For better or for worse, I've not been in a position where I've needed to decide on a data modeling strategy for 100-person data team or, bigger. So when you're in these large organizations where you have to plan for varying levels of technical ability, just industry experience, whatever, you're going to have, a recent college grad working in the same code base that somebody who's been doing it for 20 years. Maybe predefined Lego blocks work really well. I always kind of chafed against it a little bit on my smaller projects because I was just like, I don't really need all these predefined Lego blocks. Like, let me just go solve problems without adding additional steps in the way.
Yeah, and I think that depends on where you are in your career. If you're a junior analyst and you're just brought onto my team, I'd rather get you started on the Lego blocks. Let's work with facts and dimensions and things that, I'm very comfortable that you can pull together and derive the insights you need. If you're a mid-level or senior data engineer, I really don't want you working in the dimensional models. I want you closer to the source data in the data vault or even in our staging layer, trying to derive new insights and get new information out of our data and new ways we can interpret it. So I think part of that's just where you are in your career and your skill set. But, at the end of the day, I just want my two developers to produce the exact same number when they write two different reports. So if I have confidence that you can do that, then great. Yeah, work with whatever data you see fit. But the last thing I want is the business coming to me saying, why are these numbers different?
We're going to wrap here. We ask this of all of our guests. But looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry? Mike, why don't we start with you?
At the moment, today, we see a lot of, let's say, wrangling data and just dealing with data and trying to find some small solutions and just wrangling data, essentially. So I would say in 10 years from now, I would like to have, data processing where you are confident of how you essentially apply, pattern-wise processing of data processing, I would say.
I love that you use the word hope there because I could probably give 6 or 7 different doomsday scenarios for what I see data looking like in the next 10 years. But what I really hope to see, I've got 2 and they're interrelated. So I would love to see us take our data skill sets and bring them more to bear on leveraging data for social good. We do so much today with scaling businesses and growing that bottom line. I'd love to see us move away from that and think about less about sales funnels and more how can we use data to funnel people out of poverty, or how can we take conversion metrics and turn that into how do we convert more people to renewable energy. And I think we do that through my second hope, and that's more data literacy across the world, really. I think everyone needs to understand better how to use data, how to interpret data, from understanding what the numbers mean without needing a statistics degree, all the way to being able to self-serve on some of the most basic open source data that's out there today, so that we can all understand what does it mean, how to interpret it, how to properly join it together, and all derive the same insights together.
That may be the single most hopeful response we've ever gotten. Thank you for ending us on such a positive note. Mike, Brandon, this has been a tremendous amount of fun. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and Dan Poppy. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.